Hi, this is Professor Ellis, and I'd like to welcome you all to the second week of Science Fiction, English 2420 OL 74, spring semester 2021 at City Tech. Today we're going to be continuing on with figuring out exactly what science fiction is by looking at a little bit of the precursors to science fiction before we start talking about Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, which we began reading this past week in preparation for today's class. But before we get into all the science fiction lecture stuff for today's class, I want to first give you a reminder on note-taking. Just throw this up on the screen, the Cornell method of note-taking that I discussed in our last lecture. I highly recommend you use this so that you remain engaged and an active learner during the lecture portion of our class. To use this page division that's suggested by the Cornell method of your Q column over on the left, your note-taking column on the right, and then writing your summaries of each page of notes at the bottom. Again, why do I want you to do this? Again, handwriting your notes will help you remember information much better than if you were not note-taking at all, and if you were just simply typing your notes like on a computer. This type of action doesn't provide as much information-rich structure to your memories that your brain then relies on, obviously, to recall information. Because our brains don't work like computers. It's not just you're putting data in and then you pull data out. The way our minds remember things is based on our experience. So everything that's going on around us, so if we were to have lots of distractions around us, that actually make it harder for us to remember things, for us to learn things. So we want to have an ideal as possible location for our studying, and we want to use rich information practices that don't overwhelm our senses, but that reinforce our senses and our brain's ability to remember things, and that we can do through handwriting our notes. Now, besides wanting you to learn everything there is to know about science fiction and to earn your science fiction master membership card, right? I want you to practice some of these things that I show you in our class, not only in your other classes, but also once you get into the workplace, because these things can be incredibly beneficial and useful to you later on. So for our class, keep in mind that note-taking is a big part of your grade. And so I'm going to go over to our syllabus, and so here I am on our Open Lab course site, which I've sent you links to before. Almost everybody has gotten in. Those of you that are taking the class with an e-permit, I've reached out to Open Lab support to get you onboarded. I haven't heard back yet. If you hear from them before I do, please let me know. But hopefully we can get you onboarded with your own account soon. But in the meantime, as I've mentioned to those students, you're still able to leave comments for these first assignments in the class. It won't be until later that everybody will need to have an account on Open Lab and access to turn in your research paper project later on in the semester. But that'll be toward the very end. So here I am on our Open Lab course site, and I'm going to click on Syllabus over here on the left. And under Grading, we can see that the weekly writing summaries, these are the weekly writing assignments that you'll have 1 week to do after each lecture. Those are 20% of your grade. But it's these two parts here that are really super important for note-taking in the class, that I'll have you make scanned copies of your notes up until the midterm. That'll be 20% of your grade. And then again, you will scan your notebook from the midterm to the final for another 20% of your grade. So 40% of your grade is simply good note-taking practice. And all I'm grading that on is best effort. I encourage you to use the Cornell method, but you don't have to use the Cornell method if you already have an established way that you make notes. But what I do say for these assignments is that the note-taking has to be done by handwriting, not by typing your notes up into a computer. Certainly you can do that afterwards if you want. If you want to keep like, a typed up copy of your notes, I have no problem with that. But for this first pass on your note taking in the class based on our lectures together and then your readings, because you also want to make notes in your notebook about the readings that we have in the class. There's a whole lot of readings that we have to go through, and it's important that you keep them all straight, like who wrote the stories, when were they written, who are the main characters, what was it about, and also importantly, what are the connections between the story and the science and technology that make it science fiction. So all these things should be elements that you add to your notebooks. And again, you're going to be grading your notebooks in some sort of like, fine-tooth combing way, okay? I don't want you to like be overly stressed about the notebooks. Simply make your notebooks. You'll get all the credit for that. It's an issue where a student doesn't do note-taking, doesn't create the notebooks, that they don't get credit. So hopefully that won't be a problem. I don't think it'll be a problem for you guys. But I do just want to throw that out there. So note-taking, super important. Some housekeeping stuff I wanted to mention. So going back over to our Open Lab course site, each week, as I've mentioned before, I will be posting at the very top of our Open Lab course site a lecture. So here's last week's lecture, and whenever you're watching this, you'll see there's a new post here that says lecture, week 2. And then underneath that, there'll be a post for the weekly writing assignment. And so I'll post a new thing here for weekly writing assignment week 2. So whatever is the current work in the class will be a sticky post, meaning that they're affixed to the very top of our Open Lab course site for that week. And then once the week's over, they'll begin falling down, right, in reverse chronological order. But now what you'll also find that I won't post as stickies, but will be things that I post in the reverse chronological order of these posts at the bottom of the page, will be announcements. And so I would recommend when you visit our course site to watch the lecture, to post your weekly writing assignment, is you can either scroll down or you can click on this link over on the left that says announcements. So how I use announcements will be for a variety of reasons. Like if there's anything important involving the class, I may use it to post something that I need you to know right away. But what might be the more likely way that I use it more often will be to let you know about things that I hear about that are relevant to our class and you all as City Tech students. So if I hear about an opportunity for an event, or maybe an opportunity to get like a free ebook that is related to science fiction or anything like that, I'll post it as an announcement. And that way it'll just be up to you to go through, scan some of those, and see if there's something that you might be interested in. Now, so far, I haven't seen anything that I'm going to post as announcements that will be on a magnitude big enough to constitute like something that could be extra credit, but I will keep an eye out for those. And in the past, the way that I've done extra credit opportunities for students is that I'll say if you go to this event, like it might be an hour, 2 hour, 3 hour event, and right now obviously the events will all be online because of the pandemic, but then you would write a 250 word summary of the event and email it to me, and then I would add that to your record in my gradebook that you earn some extra credit. And extra credit, usually the way that I do that is I either let it replace a missed weekly writing assignment, or I'll use it to add to a project assignment. So like if, for example, you have, like say, an A- on your final research paper. Well, if you've done an extra credit assignment, I can use that, look at the grade, and then may be able to flip that A- to an A, that sort of thing. So I mean, it's not going to be earth-shattering. It's not going to, one extra credit assignment will not change say a D to a C, but whenever there's that marginal difference, then it gives me something that I can show. I have proof that you've done that extra work, that you're engaged, you're committed to what we're trying to do in our class, and give you a bump to whatever that grade might be. So this will be something that I'll let you guys know about more as the semester goes on. But I would also ask you all, because I mean, you obviously have your ears to the ground in all of the different social networks you're a part of. So if you hear something that you'll relate to the class, that other students might be interested in, that could constitute just an announcement or could constitute an announcement that involves extra credit, let me know. I'll take a look at it, and if I think that this is something we should share with everybody, I'll send it out and either make it just an announcement or say there could be extra credit attached to it if you participate, and then do that extra writing for the extra credit. So these will be some things that you can kind of watch for, and I'll mention during the lectures too when those things come up. All right, so that's housekeeping stuff. We need to look ahead with the syllabus. So let's hop back over to the syllabus real quick on our Open Lab course site. And let's go down to the tentative class schedule here at the bottom. And so we've already done week 1. That's what you're finishing up today. You've begun reading Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. I gave you a link to the 1831 edition on Project Gutenberg. Again, you can also buy these books, these stories that we're reading. They're available in a lot of different places. But the links that I've provided should give you a free way of reading the content of the story so that you can do the readings without necessarily having to buy other text in the class. You're going to be wrapping up your weekly writing assignment. And most, I think maybe the majority of students have already done that. I'll be getting back to students as quickly as I can, trying to reply to those this week. As we move forward, I won't be replying to all of your weekly writing posts, but it'll be a record that constitutes your engagement in the class. And it also contributes to the writing that you need to do, with this being a writing intensive course that some of you are also taking for that kind of credit in. Now for this week, we're going to begin talking about precursors to science fiction and the very beginning lectures on Frankenstein. For next week, make sure that you are keeping up with the reading as much as you can and read chapters 9 through 17 in the Project Gutenberg edition. Now, one thing to mention is if you're reading Frankenstein from a print edition, it could be divided into volumes, because originally the way it was published was in 3 volumes. If that is the case, you'll probably want to take a look at the Gutenberg edition of the text, and you'll be able to figure out where the chapter divisions lie depending on which volume you're in. I think that would be the most straightforward way, rather than me trying to account for all the different ways that you might see that. And if you have questions about that, let me know simply by letting me know which edition of the book you have. Tell me who the publisher is. Maybe take a picture of the front cover or send me a link to where you might find it on Amazon. That way I can take a look at the table of contents and I can help you figure that out. Now for next week, there's going to be another 250 word, 1-page double-spaced weekly writing assignment due on Open Lab. And for this week's weekly writing assignment, the main thing that I want you to do is to summarize some of the main points from today's lecture and talk about your reading of Frankenstein. So a big part of it can be from the lecture, and then you can have a little bit of it from Frankenstein, or vice versa, or you can make them equal. Again, I'm just looking for your engagement in these ideas in the class, both from lecture as well as from the reading. If you're making good notes, you have all the material that you will need to choose from to write the weekly writing assignment. So if you do the notes, all you have to do is start pulling some of that material out from your notes, both from the lecture and from your reading, type it up, 250 words, and then post that. And again, all I'm looking for is best effort on that. I'm not looking and grading it in terms of like, oh, you forgot to mention this one point, or you didn't mention this other thing. That's not what I'm looking at. But now what I do want and do expect you to do is that whenever you get to the point of writing your weekly writing assignments, you should be going over your notes and making sure like your names are spelled correctly, the titles of books are spelled correctly. And I'll talk about that during today's class, one of the easiest ways to do that. And that I think for you all, you can rely on sources like Wikipedia, as well as the Encyclopedia of Science Fiction, which I'll show you. As a way of just double checking things, maybe you're getting another take on something by reading it over. That as a resource to help with your learning, I have no problem whatsoever with a resource like Wikipedia. The only issue that'll come up later is like with your research project is that a place like Wikipedia is what we call an aggregator of information. It brings information together from a lot of different sources, but Wikipedia is not the originator of those ideas. It pulls references from other places that have to then be cited. So what we want to do is go to where that information actually originates, where it comes from. And that's where we turn to the books, where we turn to journals, where we turn to magazines, newspapers, websites, etc. So we'll talk more about that when we get into your research for the research essay in the class. But you can begin practicing some of these things and recognizing how some of these things are different through the way you engage the text in our class. Because as I'll talk about, I don't want you to just simply read the text and leave it at that. You should be doing a little bit extra work on your own using these very easy to access resources that we have on the internet. All right, so let's see. Looking ahead in the syllabus, and now we have our lecture to begin today. All right, so before we really begin discussing science fiction as a genre or type of literature or a cultural category, we need to take a look at the progenitors of the genre. And we need to consider the cultural, social, and historical contexts out of which science fiction developed. So as we're doing this, make sure you have your notebooks out. Again, you don't have to capture everything, but try to listen to like keywords that you'll put over in your Q column, your more detailed notes that you put over in the note-taking column, and then after you've taken all the notes for this week's lecture, turn back to your notes and then write your 1 or 2 sentence summaries at the bottom of each page, summarizing what's on that page of notes. So first, let's talk about some examples of stories that, looking backwards, might be something we consider science fictional. But they can't be said to be science fiction per se, since science itself as a concept had not yet been invented in those ancient times, or they were written during that process, during that time when the whole idea of what science is was debated into existence, beginning in the Renaissance and then the Age of Enlightenment, which we'll talk about today. So some of these precursors to science fiction, or SF, include the following. And remember, when I say SF, you just write SF, capitals, no periods, no spaces. Just put the 2 letters together, capital S, capital F. So one of my favorites, which is a key element of Darmok, the 2nd episode of season 5 of Star Trek The Next Generation, is the Mesopotamian epic of Gilgamesh. And that's spelled Gilgamesh, Gilgamesh. And this is roughly from 2150 to 2000 BC. And it's about Gilgamesh, the king of Uruk, U-R-U-K, who goes on adventures with his friend Enkidu, spelled E-N-K-I-D-U. And Enkidu is a wild man who had been created by the gods to stop Gilgamesh's oppression of his people. Like a challenger. He challenges Gilgamesh and they fight. And essentially Gilgamesh wins, but him and Enkidu form a bond of friendship. Now, Gilgamesh and Enkidu's exploits of killing the great mountain keeper and the bull of heaven anger the gods, including a goddess whose advances are spurned by Gilgamesh. The gods kill Enkidu as revenge on Gilgamesh. In despair, following his friend's death, Gilgamesh goes on a journey seeking eternal life to learn that long life is unattainable, but immortality in memory is. Now, one surviving fragment of the poem describes Gilgamesh in translation as, quote, he who saw the deep, or, quote, he who sees the unknown, end quote. Those things, they evoke something that's science fictional, I think. The next story that I'll mention as a precursor to science fiction is Prometheus. This character in Greek mythology first appeared in Hesiod's Theogony in 8th century BC Greece. And Prometheus is a Greek myth in which not just there are myths about him, but this character is in poetry and dramas that focused on this particular mythic figure. And Prometheus was a titan who would dare give humanity the gift of fire. But in retribution, he's chained to a rock where an eagle would feast on his regenerating liver each day. This continued until Hercules eventually rescued him. But there's these ideas of intelligence, of him being a champion of humanity. And also we can think of fire obviously as like this great gift. It's what enables so much of human civilization. And also ultimately leads to the sciences, and we can think of fire and fire making as a technology. Next we have Ovid's Metamorphoses, and this is from 8 AD. And in these stories there are elements of transformation, miracles, supreme powers, hanky-panky between gods and mortals. So there's like this interaction between humanity and their gods in these stories collected in Metamorphoses by Ovid here. Then we have Lucian's True History from the 2nd century. And it has elements of travel to outer space, of alien life, and even of interplanetary war. So some of the core tenets of what we think of as science fictional today appeared quite early in our literary history here with Lucian. But again, there wasn't the science and technology that supported how these things would actually take place. And so in a sense, this is more fantastical in the way that Lucian's True History is written than what we would think of later, and that we'll be reading in just a few weeks of Lensman, one of the stories that we're going to be taking a look at that involves interplanetary war. We have Beowulf from the 8th to the 11th century. And you might be familiar with this. You might have read this in like a high school literature class. in translation, but we have Beowulf, in particular, battles the creature Grendel. Then he battles Grendel's mother, and then finally the dragon, who he defeats, but then ultimately kills him. And you can see in this illustration of Beowulf as he's found dying after slaying the dragon. So again, these fantastical elements, but it's also important to think of like how these elements that are fantastical, like Grendel and the dragon, are showing something we'll talk about more later this semester about otherness, about differences between ourselves and the other is spelled with a capital O, meaning difference of like something that's very different than ourselves. So if you imagine like with alien life, for example, they're going to be very unlike ourselves, and so there's going to be this othering where we recognize the differences between them, the alien, and humanity, ourselves. Then we have the Nibelungenlied, or the Song of the Nibelungs from 13th century. And in this story we have Siegfried the Dragon Slayer and his betrayal and murder depicted here, and his wife's revenge on these wrongdoers who have betrayed Siegfried. Then we have Thomas More's Utopia. This is an important title that I do want you to make sure you have in your notes. Utopia is spelled Utopia, and it was published in 1516, originally written in Latin. And its title has multiple meanings in its Greek roots. So, and this ambiguity is something that Thomas More, again, just make sure you know how to spell his name, is Thomas, Thomas More, More. And these Greek roots for this word that he created, utopia, that he coined, is another way that we say when you make up a word. He wanted there to be ambiguity there. So on the one hand, the first part, utopia, could in Greek be eu, meaning good, but it could also be ou, meaning not. And so if we take those two suffixes, whether it be good or not, and add it to the last part of the word topia, which in Greek is topos, T-O-P-O-S. Topos means place. So we have either the good place or no place. And so that ambiguity between the meaning of what utopia is intentional. It's something for us to think about. That is both like this perfect good place, but because it is perfect, because it is good, ideal, it doesn't really exist anywhere, because our world is far too complicated and messy for us to live in a utopia. And the story itself is about a place, as you can see depicted here from one of the early editions. This is a woodcut illustration, that it's this land that's rational, it's communistic, meaning everybody works and shares the fruits of their labors. It's planned, so there's a planning for how the land is divided and where things are, where people live and work. And it founds the importance of philosophers to everyday life. That philosophy isn't something that just takes place in an ivory tower. It's something that's rooted in their daily existence. And utopia is like a very important concept that reappears many times in science fiction, as well as its opposite, dystopia, meaning bad place, which we'll see and talk about during the semester. So another work, and there's a few more I want to get through before we get to the historical context, we have Johann Kepler's Somnium, Somnium, and translated, this is the dream, and the manuscript was completed in 1610. And this is an interesting book in which the footnotes, which were longer than the text, the story itself, explained what planetary observations might be from another heavenly body. In a sense, this book is a veiled attempt for Kepler to protect himself and his support for the heliocentric view of the solar system. You probably have heard of heliocentric before from a science class, but just as a reminder, heliocentric means sun-centered view of the solar system. And at that time, around 1600s, it was apocryphal, it was punishable to imagine the universe not being centered on the earth. This was, a religious view that was imposed on people to follow, this dogma that people were called to follow. But people like Kepler, who was an astronomer by trade, wanted to, as he's observing the heavens with his instruments, he begins to see from the data that the universe can't be Earth-centered. It didn't make sense with the way the planets and the moon and the sun all moved in relation to one another. But Kepler also knew that he could get in a whole hell of a lot of trouble if he were just to say the heliocentric view is the accurate way for us to talk about how the solar system works and the universe works. So he writes this story that's very fantastical. There is a demon that's offering these stories to these humans in the story about like what it's like to look at Earth from the moon. And so you're getting this idea of what it would look like to see the Earth from another planetary body in terms of like, how this is going to affect, when we look at the moon, the phases of the moon, similar things are going to happen when you observe the Earth from other places in our solar system. And so he was able to put in the story his science, but because it's just a story, if anyone were to attack him and say, this is sacrilege, these ideas that you're promoting here, Kepler would be able to say like, look, this is all just made up. What are you talking about? This is just a story. And that way, science, if we want to call this proto-science fiction or some precursor to science fiction, it was a way of protecting the ideas within the story itself. And we see this technique used and throughout the history of science fiction and the types of stories that lead to it, such as these. Next we have Shakespeare's The Tempest. This is from 1610 to 1611. And in this story, Prospero, this fellow right here, is a sorcerer who commands an island where he lives with his daughter Miranda and two servants, the monstrous Caliban and the spirit Ariel. And Prospero uses his magic to create a storm that causes a ship to wreck on his island. There are connections between Shakespeare's Prospero and Victor Frankenstein that you can think about, particularly if you're familiar with The Tempest. I mean, you could just read the summary on Wikipedia and get an idea about what the story is. But Prospero and Frankenstein both use their powers in an attempt to win back something that they had lost. But they do so without considering the ramifications, the collateral damage, the unintended consequences of their actions. And this is something that's I think bottled up in the idea of the mad scientist. Someone who is pursuing science and pursuing some scientific discovery, without considering the consequences or not caring about the consequences of that science. We see this even in contemporary science fiction. We think about, like, maybe most recently with the Jurassic Park franchise of films. It's not, whether we could do something, but whether we should do something. Then the penultimate example I want to give you, penultimate's a good word for you guys to put in your notes so that you'll know this when you're on Jeopardy one day. Penultimate means next to last. Ultimate would be the last. So the penultimate example is Sir Francis Bacon's New Atlantis from 1627. And New Atlantis is, in a sense, he's like taking Thomas More's idea of a utopia, but creating something that is more scientifically aligned rather than philosophically aligned. And so Francis Bacon's New Atlantis is about a place called Bensalem, Bensalem, that is a society that embraces science and scientifically gained knowledge to plan itself and to operate itself. And so basically the society is founded on scientific principles. And then the last example that I wanted to talk about briefly is Jonathan Swift's Gulliver's Travels from 1726. And these are a collection of fantastic journeys. And we could also call this book a travel log, meaning it's a collection of stories about traveling, which were very popular at this time, because you imagine not everybody had opportunities to travel, and so those that could would write about their experiences. But in this case, we have stories that are written by this fictional traveler to very fantastic lands and meeting very strange organisms and, in a sense, alien life on Earth and other places. But what's key about Jonathan Swift's stories in Gulliver's Travels is this is political satire veiled in the fantastic. And so even though we can read the stories just simply for enjoyment, that if you look at the history of the stories, you'll find that they're embedded with this contemporary politics and political fighting that meant something to Swift's contemporaries that to us is more a historical, has a historical element to it that is not as relevant to today's politics as it was then. Now, through these examples, we get a sense of like how science fiction's precursors had elements of the fantastic, but they also began over time to acquire more of a rational basis, more of what came to be known as science, as a founding or an integral part of the story. But as I said before, during most of these examples I just gave, science itself wasn't yet what we think of it as today. Certainly there was trial and error, there was attempts to quantify, attempts to provide rational basis for things, both in terms of engineering, as well as different understandings of the world and how it works. But there wasn't yet like a formalized idea of what science was, the scientific approach to studying the world. But all of that began to crystallize, began to become more real and formal during the tail end of these examples that I just gave you. And so we can't have science fiction without science, okay? So what brought about science? What brought about the kinds of thinking that needed to be in place for what we're going to describe as the first work of science fiction, which is Mary Shelley's Frankenstein in 1818. So what I would like to talk about next are the historical and cultural contexts for science fiction. And so here, these are like the main points that I'm going to discuss. And so you can use these as your cue words over on the left column of your notes. And then I'm going to fill in some details that you can put over on the right-hand side in your note-taking area. So first off, we have the Enlightenment, also called the Age of Enlightenment or the Age of Reason. So the Enlightenment began in England in the 17th century. And we can think of it as providing an illuminated, meaning a lit up present, contrasted with a dark past. And the illumination comes from the key word there, reason. That we can use reason, we can use logic, we can use rationality to make sense of a world that's otherwise dark when all we do is follow dogma, just follow religious tenets without questioning them. And so key to the Enlightenment is a tremendous skepticism. Skepticism, S-K-E-P-T-I-C-I-S-M. Skepticism is questioning, that you're not just accepting the status quo of things or what you're told to believe. Now there's 7 characteristics that I'll share with you of the Enlightenment. So first, reason is the most significant and positive capacity of the human. That reason is what sets humanity apart from all other life forms on the planet. 2, reason enables one to break free from primitive, dogmatic, and superstitious beliefs, holding one in the bonds of irrationality and ignorance. So reason lifts the human being up from irrationality and ignorance. 3, in realizing the liberating potential of reason, one not only learns to think correctly, but to act correctly as well. And this is a key part of the Age of Reason, of the Enlightenment, is that reason is something that also allows us to formulate and understand an ethics that doesn't have to be dependent upon a mythology or a religious dogma. That in a sense, we can figure out how to act together as human beings in society, based on rationality, reasoning out how we should act to one another, rather than just simply being told this is the way that we should act. 4, through philosophical and scientific progress, reason can lead humanity as a whole to a state of earthly perfection. And this was, we might call this a utopian ideal of the Enlightenment, that through philosophical progress, through scientific progress, reason would lead us to this promised land of a better world where we all exist together, where we're able to all pursue our own best interests, in following rational principles. 5, reason makes all humans equal and therefore deserving of equal liberty and treatment before the law. Now this is a very important point that comes out of the Enlightenment that we're still reckoning with today, in which if we understand that all human beings are rational beings, that they're all capable of reason, then it's on the basis of our rationality that we are all equal to one another. That one person isn't superior or inferior to another if we all have the capacity for reason. And this is what informs everything about equality between men and women, between the races, between those persons of different countries, etc. 6. Beliefs of any sort should be accepted only on the basis of reason and not on traditional or priestly authority. Again, this is the rejection of dogma and the rejection of like tradition, the things that were done before. That if we're skeptical of things, we're going to question it, and we're going to want to understand why things are that way, and maybe that's not the best way to do things, and maybe we can find a better way through our reason. And then 7, all human endeavors should seek to impart and develop knowledge, not feelings or character. And again, this is an ideal of the Enlightenment, but the idea is that the things that we do should seek to develop knowledge so that we learn more about ourselves and about the world, and not focus too much on like emotions, feelings, personal character. If you want to think about this last point, this is in a sense like the Vulcan way that's embedded in the Enlightenment. Obviously, they didn't know what Vulcans were from Star Trek, but we can see how Gene Roddenberry's idea of the Vulcan race in the Star Trek universe embodies like the ideal aspects of the Enlightenment. Everything's through reason, rationality, no emotion. Everything's for the acquiring of knowledge and learning more. Now, the second big historical event that comes out of the Enlightenment that needed to take place for there to be science fiction is the scientific revolution. So the scientific revolution began with the work of Copernicus. Copernicus, his name is spelled Copernicus, and he lived from 1473 to 1543. And he argued for a heliocentric universe, meaning that the universe was sun-centered. Now, as a part of the scientific revolution, there was the idea that the universe was knowable to human beings. The universe was knowable to human beings. That we could challenge assumptions, that we could challenge beliefs, that we could challenge the lore, the stories that get passed down. And it's from the scientific revolution that we get the ideas of scientific observation, theorizing, hypothesizing, and testing that produced reliable and reproducible results that enriched our understanding of the universe. And these ideas, again, were not something that just came out of nowhere. They were ideas that had to be debated openly by people using their reason, using rationality to figure out how can we achieve these ideals of understanding the world better? What technique, what tools do we need? And that's where this idea of what science is came from. Now, some key aspects or key figures that I want you to know from the scientific revolution include Copernicus and his heliocentrism, 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 meaning sun-centered universe. Then we have Kepler, who I already mentioned, Johann Kepler, Kepler, and what he discovered, besides supporting the heliocentric view of the universe, he's the one that discovered elliptical orbits rather than perfectly circular orbits to heavenly bodies. Elliptical. Elipitcal. Sorry. Next, we got Galileo, Galileo. And with Galileo, we have modern astronomy. And then the last two, we have Newton, who, along with others, gave us the calculus in mathematics, which was very important for the things that would follow in terms of science and technology, engineering. But we also have Descartes, and his name is spelled Descartes. And René Descartes, he was a philosopher, and you may know him most notably from cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. But he is the one that tried to arrive at a philosophy from the only thing that we can know about the world. And that he started with the idea that he is a being capable of thought, and it's from thought that he exists. And from those principles, he then constructed this much larger philosophy about the human being and our relationship to the world. So very important to the scientific revolution. Now, next, after that, we get the Industrial Revolution. And the Industrial Revolution took place from like 1760 to 1850. And it was during this time we began to see agricultural advancements, like being able to produce better yields of crops to field a growing population. We see changes in industrial organization in which the way things are produced get changed. So instead of producing things using like a cottage industry where things are done in the home, things are moved to what we would today recognize as being factories, where there are processes begin to be broken down. Rather than one person doing everything to make a widget, we have the widget broken down into different processes, each one conducted by different people. The idea of like an assembly line. We saw new technologies of production and transportation, and this is where technology is both used to devise new ways of making things, but also in how to transport all of these goods that are being produced to market, to the people, to the consumers that would be buying them. And these things led to increased production, increased efficiency, and increased profits. And the increase in commerce, both foreign and domestic. So we're beginning to see not just growth in terms of producing things for like your corner of the world, your country, or your region of your country, but that these goods are beginning to go much further away and reaching much further markets, much further consumers from where they were originally produced. Now, on the cultural side of this Age of Enlightenment, Age of Reason, Scientific Revolution, and the Industrial Revolution, there is a rebellion taking place, and that's Romanticism. So during all of these really exciting things going on with reason, rationality, and the sciences and industrialization, it's also beginning to cause a lot of social change and revolution. And there's the so-called 5 I's, capital I, I's of Romanticism that captures the main characteristics of this movement. The 5 I's that you should put in your notes include imagination, intuition, idealism, inspiration, and individuality. Imagination, intuition, idealism, inspiration, and individuality. And these are, essentially, pushing back against some of the forces at play, where you can imagine, like, the Enlightenment is promoting reason over emotion. That is with the Industrial Revolution, we're beginning to see people becoming cogs in, like, the larger production machine and not being seen as individuals any longer. And so Romanticism is pushing back against these things that are taking place in the world at that time. Now, the British Romantic period ran from about 1785 to 1830, and the German Romanticism began a little bit afterwards, and there's some differences in the way that they played out. Whereas the British Romanticism was more serious, more earnest, the Germans valued humor and wit as a way to push back against these Enlightenment and scientific and industrial forces. So there's two important works that I'll mention that you might look up on your own. Just go to Wikipedia and look them up, and I'll just give a plug here. As you probably saw as I was going through the first part of the lecture, this is something that I would have done, like when we were meeting in person in class, is I would walk into the classroom early, open a web browser, and begin pulling up the Wikipedia pages for some of the topics and people that I'm going to lecture on. I do that for two reasons. One, obviously, I can find a really great picture or a really great illustration that anchors what I'm going to talk about in my lecture from Wikipedia. But second, I want to encourage you all to use Wikipedia and to use Google searches as a way to find out a little bit more about the topics we're going to be discussing. I'm not expecting you to spend all day there. I don't want you to fall down the rabbit hole, though you might on occasion do that. But I think that it's beneficial to use some of these tools that we have access to form a way of, in a sense, giving our minds a hook to hang ideas on. And what I mean by that, you have like a hook on the wall you can hang your hat or hang your coat on. Well, if we don't know anything about whatever it is we're about to talk about, then you're having to try to figure out how to connect what the new stuff is to what you already know. But one way to kind of help yourself, to prime yourself to be more receptive to new ideas, to learning new things, is to learn a little background on them. And one of the easiest ways to do that is simply pull up the Wikipedia page for whatever it is that we're going to talk about. You could look up the writer on Wikipedia. You could look up maybe the story that we're going to be talking about. There might be a page for it. You can also use a Google search and see what other people might be talking about out there about whatever the topic is. And by scanning some of that material beforehand, you're actually improving your own ability to engage and then ultimately remember the thing that you're learning. And you can use this technique in any class and in the workplace later on. So like in your other classes, you got a topic, you got a textbook, you can look at that. But why not see what's on Wikipedia first before you turn to like the heady stuff that's in the textbook? Or vice versa, read what's in the textbook and then get some more background through Wikipedia, or even better yet, going to the library journals, which I'll show you and talk more about later this semester. Because one of the things, just to make a distinction between, Wikipedia is a great place to begin research because it aggregates information from different places, but it has the list of sources at the bottom of the page, which you can then use in your own research, because that should be places where knowledge starts, is in those references, not in the page on Wikipedia, because all it's doing is reporting things that come from somewhere else. But now if you go to the databases in the library, there you have vetted information by professionals in those fields, learned people, that they're essentially telling you, this is the good stuff. This is new knowledge cutting edge that you can learn something from, that you can incorporate into your own learning and maybe build on yourself through your research. And the key thing about the journals that we have access through the library is they cost a lot of money. Like when you're not a student at City Tech anymore, you will no longer have access to those journals. So while you're a student here, take advantage of it. Use those to learn more. Certainly you can use it in our science fiction class. That would be great. Okay, don't get me wrong. I would like you to do that. But if we want to talk about, pragmatics, meaning like, what are we going to have to prioritize here? You all are trying to get degrees that are going to help you land jobs that will provide you with a career. Well, there's a lot of people that are graduating right now, and that have already graduated that might not have found a job yet because job markets are kind of bad in a lot of fields right now, not just because of the pandemic. And so you need to be able to show how much more qualified you are than all those other people that have the same degrees that you got. Well, one of the ways you can do that is by learning more than what you simply get in your classes, by diving into the databases, reading that cutting edge, brand new research that's too new to find its way into your classes. So make use of these resources. And you can make use of it in our class, but you can also, maybe more importantly, make use of it in your major classes. All right, that's my spiel for that about doing a little background research. But the background research I suggested are on two important works. We got Wordsworth's lyrical ballads. Wordsworth, his name is W-O-R-D-S-W-O-R-T-H. Wordsworth's lyrical ballads, which has a very significant preface that he kind of lays out what Romanticism is. And then Percy Bysshe Shelley's A Defense of Poetry. Let me spell Shelley's name for you. Percy is P-E-R-C-Y. Bysshe is spelled B-Y-S-S-H-E. Shelley, S-H-E-L-L-E-Y. And if you notice, we got Shelley there. That's important for you to remember because Mary Shelley was Percy Bysshe Shelley's spouse. And so their ideas go back and forth. They're connected in a lot of ways. So Wordsworth's lyrical ballads and Percy Bysshe Shelley's The Defense of Poetry. And so some of the key ideas about what Romanticism is that it really favors imagination and power of the human mind and our spontaneous emotional response to what we experience. And essentially, the poet brings nature, the outside world, into the mind via the eye and our other senses. We work over what we experience of nature in our imagination, and it's through that work of the imagination that we give nature meaning. We give it human meaning. In a sense, we're not saying nature is this thing isolated from us, that in a sense, nature doesn't mean anything without the human being involved. That's Romanticism at its heart. And Wordsworth, in his preface to Lyrical Ballads, says that good poetry is, quote, the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings, end quote. And there's an emphasis on external nature as a stimulus to the poet. It's what gives the poet something to work with, the material the poet works with. And so there's this connecting the natural world with human experience. And one important work to think about that is from this fellow named Edmund Burke, E-D-M-U-N-D-B-U-R-K-E, Edmund Burke. In 1757, he published a book called Philosophical Inquiry into the Origin of Our Ideas of the Sublime and Beautiful. philosophical inquiry into the origin of our ideas of the sublime and beautiful. So the sublime, which is what was preferred by the Romantics, is, and I'll just read off some of these characteristics. These are all quotes directly from Edmund Burke. The sublime is vast in their dimensions, rugged and negligent, loves the right line, and when it deviates, it often makes a strong deviation. It's dark and gloomy, solid and even massive, and founded on pain. And wrapped up into the idea of pain is like terror, danger, and fear. Now, he contrasts sublime and sublimity with the beautiful. And beautiful is something that's preferred by the neoclassicists, people that are looking back at classical forms, like from the Romans and the Greeks in antiquity. And some of the beautiful's characteristics include, and again, this all comes from Edmund Burke, comparatively small, smooth and polished, shunned the right line, yet deviated from it insensibly, should not be obscure. It's light and delicate, and it's founded on pleasure as opposed to the sublime's founding on pain. So again, getting back to the Romantics, there's this shift from writing about others, that's a neoclassicist kind of thing, to writing about the self. The assumption is that the narrator is the writer, him or herself, or as solitary figures outside organized society on an arduous and long quest. And also there's the promise of the French Revolution in the early 1790s. Quote, many writers viewed a human being as endowed with limitless aspiration toward an infinite good envisioned by the faculty of the imagination, end quote. So this is Romanticism with a capital R. And then the last thing, the last context that we need before we can get into what is science fiction and how is Mary Shelley's Frankenstein the first example of it, is the Gothic. And so the Gothic is connected to Romanticism. It's a darker vision of humanity's relationship to nature, perhaps allied to the sublime, reconfiguring humanity as subject to a mysterious and unforgiving external reality. Now, 5 characteristics of the Gothic that I'll give you include: 1, the setting is old, it's isolated, usually involves like a castle, and it's very overbearing, like oppressive. Second characteristic of the Gothic is that there are supernatural elements. The third characteristic is that there are often secrets that drive the story. The fourth characteristic of the Gothic is that there are boundaries crossed. There's this crossing of boundaries between what we might think of as like, maybe the everyday world and then this more supernatural setting. And the fifth characteristic is that there is emotional content involving suspense, horror, foreboding, and terror. The first example of the Gothic is a book by Horace Walpole, Walpole, from 1764 called The Castle of Otranto, Otranto, a Gothic story. Other examples include Anne Radcliffe's The Mysteries of Udolpho from 1794. There's Matthew Lewis's The Monk from 1796, and one that you've probably heard of before, Bram Stoker's Dracula from 1897. So now all these things that we've just discussed play important roles in kind of laying the framework, the foundation, and the framework that comes from that for science fiction to appear. So again, first off, you can't have science fiction without science. And on the fictional side, we needed things like Romanticism and the Gothic, those characteristics of those stories to be around for the eventual science fiction writers to borrow and play on in their own work. And so in Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, the first thing that we're reading in this class is going to be what founds the genre that we're looking at, science fiction. And so here, this is a painting of Mary Shelley. And so I'll leave this on the screen as I begin some of the background notes for who she was and what are some of the things that you should know about Frankenstein as you begin working your way into the novel. Now, I warn you that during today's lecture, I'm going to talk about some things that you may not have read yet in Frankenstein, that they're spoilers. That's okay. One thing to keep in mind is that it's okay in the context of our class to read ahead, to like maybe look at a Wikipedia page for a story we're going to read, or find some background about the story on another website before you read it, because that makes it easier for you to understand the story rather than having to figure out everything fresh. Now, if you want to do that, I'm not going to dissuade you from just like reading things fresh without having doing that prep work. I'm just saying that doing that prep work can make your engagement and reading of the story more interesting, because instead of having to just worry about what is going on in the story and understanding that, if you already understand what the story is about before reading it, then you can start paying attention to some of the more interesting aspects, such as the influence of science on the story, of technology, and the interplay between science and technology and the human characters in the story, the societal elements of the story that we can discuss in more depth as we move through the semester. So I don't want you to think like spoilers are a bad thing in the context of our class. I understand, like, with a big movie coming out, you don't want to know what's going on because you just want to enjoy the story. But in this case, it's okay to understand the story beforehand so that you can, in a sense, sink your teeth more deeply into the work and find out what's going on and how it relates to other things by reading it. So, to start off, the British science fiction writer and critic Brian Aldiss, Aldiss, and others argue that Mary Shelley's Frankenstein is the first example of what we now call science fiction. Of course, at the time Frankenstein was published, there was not yet a term for that kind of literature. It draws on many generic elements, namely Gothic literature, mythology, and travel narratives, and it builds on ideas that were of utmost importance at that time, including the Age of Enlightenment, the Scientific Revolution, the Industrial Revolution, and Romanticism. These things we just discussed. So make sure you put in your notes Mary Shelley's full name, Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley. So we have Mary, M-A-R-Y. Wollstonecraft is W-O-L-L-S-T-O-N-E-C-R-A-F-T, Wollstonecraft Shelley, S-H-E-L-L-E-Y. Make sure you spell that correctly. Shelley has two E's, Shelley. Now also put in your notes when she was born and when she died. When it comes to all the writers in our class, I want you to know birth and death dates. It's important to be able to understand the chronology of when these people lived and when they were doing their writing. So Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley was born in 1797 and she died in 1851. Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley is the daughter of two of the most famous radicals of that era. Her mother, Mary Wollstonecraft, okay, so just Mary Wollstonecraft, she shares that name with her mother. Mary Wollstonecraft was a pioneering feminist theorist who fought for equal rights for women and access to education for women. She argues for these things in her groundbreaking work, A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, WOMAN, in 1792. To put things into context, Mary Wollstonecraft began by establishing that women are rational, like men, and their supposed inferiority comes from their being denied an education. So in a sense, she's just using the ideas of the age of reason to establish that women are equal to men. The only thing that sets them apart is that women weren't allowed to go to school then. They weren't allowed an education the same way that men were. And that if you educate women, that women would be as intelligent, would have access and the ability to reason just the same as men. Now, Mary Shelley's father, William Godwin, was a minister turned atheist who gained notoriety and fame through his writing, including a work called Inquiry Concerning Political Justice and Its Influence on Morals and Happiness from 1793, which argues that humanity can progress through individual rationality and anarchism, or the absence of an imposing government. Another important work that he wrote is called Things as They Are, or The Adventures of Caleb Williams from 1794, which mirrors what Godwin sees as tyrannical government and its destructive effect on individuals. Now, Mary Wollstonecraft died 10 days after giving birth to Mary, her daughter, due to puerperal septicemia, blood poisoning. Godwin and his daughter Mary remained very close, and he carried on his wife's ideals by educating Mary and her half-sister Fanny Imlay, who Fanny Imlay committed suicide in 1816. So both Mary Shelley and her half-sister both received an education, which at that time was very unusual for a woman to have access to. Now, why are we reading Frankenstein? It is the first novel to have a character make a choice between alchemy and the scientific method. Between alchemy and the scientific method. Alchemy is like this, magical form of, in a sense, it's a type of magic in which you use chemicals and processes and magical incantations to transmute, is one of the things you can use it for, to transmute one metal into another, such as turning lead, which is worthless, into gold, which is worth a lot of money. Obviously, with nuclear science, you'd be able to do some of these things, though why you might want to, because it'd be very dangerous and probably involve more cost than what you'd be getting out of it. But obviously at that time there wasn't an understanding of what those things were. It was simply mix these things together and suddenly you might yield something such as transmuting lead to gold, but there wasn't any basis for this outside of someone's belief that wrote it down, rather than a development through a scientific process of how to transmute one metal into another. It lacked repeatability, obviously a cornerstone of science. So in Frankenstein, we have a character who makes a choice between this alchemy, which doesn't really do anything, and the scientific method, which if you follow the scientific method, you can make discoveries, you can find out new things, you can do real things in the world with it. And it extrapolates or imagines where things might go based on the sciences of Mary Shelley's time. It explores the morality or ethics of the human use of science and technology and what effects that use might have on others. Much like some of those definitions that you might have read on the handout that I showed you in our last lecture, it is the first story to present a human problem that pivots on science and technology. And unlike a Gothic story, Frankenstein is firmly rooted in scientific extrapolation and rationality instead of the supernatural and irrationality. So I'm going to bring up Mary Shelley's Wikipedia page here just to show you. So this is the frontispiece, like a beginning illustration to the 1831 edition of Frankenstein, which you're reading. The digital copy of from Project Gutenberg. And so we have some of the principal characters here. We have Victor Frankenstein, and we have the creature that he has made here on the floor. And we see bones, books, some apparatus here in the background, bookshelf. We have these skulls here on the top. But it's useful to kind of see this and think about the relationship of these things in terms of the story. And so now I'm going to give you a brief summary of the novel, because I do want you to understand what the novel is about as you're reading it. You can skip over the next couple minutes if you don't want to hear these things as you're still reading it. But Frankenstein tells the story of the scientist Victor Frankenstein, who turned away from pseudoscience and alchemy and pursued the sciences of chemistry and galvanism to discover how to give life to inanimate matter. He constructs a creature that looks like a large man, but he abandons it in horror and disgust. The creature, a being with a mind like a blank slate, a tabula rasa, uses reason, observation, and trial and error to learn how to survive, learn to speak, read, and write. Believing that he had mastered language enough to convince a family of refugees to accept him, the creature confronts them, but they recoil in horror. Angry at humanity for how he has been treated, the creature chooses vengeance against his creator. He kills Victor's younger brother William and frames the innocent Justine. Then he bargains with his creator, build a mate for him, and he will leave humanity alone. Victor agrees to his creature's demand, travels to the far reaches of Scotland to create a female version of his creature, but then realizing she will have free will and reason just like his creature, he destroys his work before giving her life, so as to avoid her unknown choices and possibly the creation of a new race of beings like his creature. Enraged, his creature tells Victor, quote, "I will be with you on your wedding night," end quote, and flees. The creature kills Victor's best friend Clerval, and Victor is suspected of the crime. Released, Victor makes his way back to Switzerland to marry Elizabeth. After the wedding, the creature kills Elizabeth, and Victor pursues the creature all the way to the Arctic, where Victor meets Captain Walton. After Victor's death, the creature appears to Captain Walton, laments his creator's passing away, and disappears, vowing to end his own life. So that's the novel, in a nutshell. Now, to conclude today's lecture, again, this is just on beginnings, just introducing the story and some things for you to think about. Mary Shelley published her novel, and make sure you have this full name in your notes: Frankenstein, or the modern Prometheus. So again, you see the connection to mythology that we talked about at the beginning of today's lecture. Frankenstein or the modern Prometheus. So she published this novel in 1818 anonymously. Its origins lie in June 1816 of the year without a summer, very unusually cold that year, when Mary Shelley, her soon-to-be husband Percy Bysshe Shelley, the romantic poet, who at the time was still married to a woman named Harriet Westbrook, and was pregnant by her lover until she committed suicide late in 1816. Lord Byron, a romantic poet, very important person. Claire Clairmont, Mary Shelley's stepsister, and John Polidori, a writer and a physician. So they're there on the shores of Lake Geneva in Switzerland, where I showed you the picture of me and my wife from some years ago. And they plan to have a competition telling ghost stories to one another. Each person is supposed to come up with a ghost story to share with the others and see whose is the scariest. Of their attempts, Mary Shelley's was the most successful and obviously influential. What we are reading is the third edition of the novel, published in 1831. Now, the introduction by Mary Shelley and the original preface by Percy Bysshe Shelley mention Dr. Darwin. I want to point this out to you. This Dr. Darwin, who are they referring to? They're referring to Charles Darwin's grandfather, Erasmus. Erasmus Darwin was a natural philosopher in whose ideas can be found the kernels of thought that his grandson Charles Darwin nurtures to maturity. Erasmus was an atheist too. Even though Mary Shelley's father and Erasmus never met, they were often attacked together as atheist writers. Now, I don't want to go on too long today. So the last thing that I'll leave you with is how the novel is constructed. And we'll mention this again in our next lecture, but just for you to be thinking about, because you're probably wondering, like, what the hell is up with these letters at the beginning of the novel? It's kind of strange, right? So this story is told in an epistolary form. That's an important word for you to get in your notes. Epistolary, epistolary form. This means that the novel is told through letters between Captain Robert Walton and his sister Margaret Walton Saville. And within the epistolary form, there are these narrative frames, okay? Meaning that these are the parts of the story that are told from different points of view. So first we have Walton's introduction, Then we have Victor Frankenstein's narrative told to Walton. Then Victor Frankenstein relates the creature's narrative as told to Victor, but then is in turn told to Walton. Then at the end we have Walton's conclusion. And then finally we have the creature mourning his dead creator as told to Walton. So there's these different points of view that are being relayed all via these letters essentially between Captain Walton and his sister Margaret Walton Saville. So think about that in a sense we don't have direct access to the story, that everything is kind of removed from us through these letters and from these different points of view. So we'll talk more about that in our next lecture. So the idea now is to keep up with the syllabus. If you want to read ahead, you're welcome to do so. If you're still catching up, that's always fine. But you do want to try to bracket out time that you may need to get caught up in the reading. And of course, making notes of your reading while you're doing that. So by next week, I've asked you to read chapters 9 through 17 of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. And also due by next week will be a new 250-word weekly writing assignment. And in that weekly writing assignment, all you got to do is summarize some highlights from today's lecture, maybe some things about the Enlightenment, the scientific revolution, the industrial revolution, romanticism, and then a little bit about Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. And again, the weekly writing assignment, again, is just graded on best effort. I'm not going to nickel and dime you on the points that you raise, but you do want to try to make it as information rich as you can based on your notes from the readings and your notes from the lecture. You make good notes, then writing the weekly writing assignment is going to be relatively easy. Again, also remember when you're doing your weekly writing assignment, type it up someplace safe in Microsoft Word that you save to your computer, Apple Pages, Google Docs, all those are fine, and then copy and paste it into the comment box for this week's weekly writing assignment. And if you have questions about any of this, please reach out to me via an email. Because I am teaching several classes, I would ask you, I didn't mention this before, but I would ask you, always let me know what class you're in when you send me an email. You can put it in the subject, you can put it in the body of your message, doesn't matter. But let me know that you're in my science fiction class. So I know immediately where you're coming from with your question or your points that you're raising. And again, my email address is jellis@citytech.cuny.edu. You can always email me there. I have my office hours each week, 3 to 5 p.m. On Google Hangouts. The link is on the syllabus at the very top. And then also just, again, a shout out for my blog, dynamicsubspace.net. I may be posting things over the semester that are useful. Just the same way that I'll post things to our Open Lab site under announcements that may be beneficial or interesting for you all. So if you got questions, let me know. Good luck with your reading. Good luck with all your other classes. Remember to stay safe, be healthy, wear a mask. When you find a place in line to get your vaccination, please do so. I'm still waiting myself, but you might be in a special category to go ahead and get that. If you can, take advantage of that to begin protecting yourself and others as soon as possible. So good luck, and I will talk to you all again soon.